You stand at the threshold of the restricted section long after midnight has painted the castle in shades of silver and shadow, and the chain across the entrance hangs loose because someone, perhaps a careless prefect, or perhaps fate itself, has forgotten to secure it properly. The silence wraps around you like a living thing as you slip between the towering shelves where books bound in dragon hide and locked with iron clasps wait in patient darkness, their spines gleaming dully in the wan light you've conjured with a whispered lumos that sounds too loud in this cathedral of forbidden knowledge. You've been drawn here by curiosity that's been building for weeks, ever since Professor Binns mentioned in his droning Monday morning History of Magic lecture that certain spell books were removed from general circulation after the incident of 1637, when a Hufflepuff student accidentally turned the entire Great Hall into sentient pudding for 3 days. The incident was recorded in actual historical texts about early modern British education, though historians usually describe it as a disciplinary matter involving foodstuffs, without mentioning the magic, which makes you wonder what other historical events have been carefully sanitized for non-magical audiences. Your fingers trail along the spines of books whose titles make your skin prickle with anticipation. Magic Most Evil, Sonnets of a Sorcerer, The Invisible Book of Invisibility, which you can only find by touch, and Basic Hexes for the Busy and Vexed, which seems to have been misshelved because, honestly, hexes belong in the regular library. You're not looking for anything truly dark, you tell yourself. Just something that might give you an edge in defense against the dark arts, or perhaps explain why your Patronus came out looking like a confused platypus last week, which even Hermione couldn't explain, and she explains everything. The restricted section stretches back farther than seems architecturally possible, which is perfectly normal for Hogwarts, where staircases change destinations and rooms appear only on Tuesdays, and you navigate by instinct and the occasional helpful ghost until you find yourself in a corner you've never seen before, where dust motes dance in your wand light like tiny golden fairies. There, on a lectern of black wood carved with serpents and ravens intertwined, rests a book that seems to breathe. Its cover is neither leather nor cloth, but something that shifts between the two, deep midnight blue shot through with silver threads that form constellations you almost recognize, and it has no title embossed on its spine or cover, just a symbol that looks like a wand crossing a quill above an open eye. The book radiates a kind of cold warmth, if such a thing is possible, and you know with the certainty that sometimes comes in dreams that this is what you've been meant to find, though you couldn't say who or what did the meaning. Your hand hesitates above the cover, because you've read enough stories to know that touching mysterious magical books often ends with unexpected transformations, prophecies, or stern letters from the headmaster. But your curiosity outweighs your caution the way it always does, which is probably why you're in Gryffindor, despite having scored nearly equal points for Ravenclaw during your sorting. The moment your fingers make contact, the book falls open with a sigh like wind through autumn leaves, and the pages glow with a soft luminescence that makes your wand light seem harsh by comparison. The text is handwritten in a flowing script that changes as you watch, cycling through languages and alphabets, Latin, Greek, something that might be Old Norse, hieroglyphics that definitely shouldn't be in a European spellbook, and occasionally settling into English that reads like, Shakespeare had a baby with a particularly verbose potion master. You lean closer, squinting at a page that shows a diagram of what appears to be a wizard attempting to brew a potion while standing on his head, with a footnote explaining that inverted brewing was popular in the 1480s until people realized gravity still affects cauldron contents regardless of the brewer's orientation. The scholarly debate about whether medieval wizards truly understood physics or simply got lucky with their vertical brewing experiments continues to this day, with the International Confederation of Wizards hosting heated conferences where aged academics literally shoot sparks at each other while arguing about historical magical methodology. You flip to another page and discover an actual historical reference to Nicholas Flamel, the famous alchemist who died in 1418 according to Muggle records, but whom you know lived until 1992 thanks to the Philosopher's Stone, and the book contains what appears to be his personal recipe for a hangover cure, involving ginger, phoenix tears, and the hope of a better tomorrow, which is either poetic or an actual ingredient you can purchase in Diagon Alley. The handwriting changes every few pages, suggesting multiple authors across multiple centuries, and you realize you're holding not just a book, but a conversation spanning generations of wizards who added their discoveries, mistakes, and occasional doodles to these pages. One margin note reads, "Tried this on my cat. Cat now judges me in Latin, do not recommend," next to a transfiguration spell. And you can't help but smile because apparently even medieval wizards had the same problems with experimental magic that you do. Another note in different handwriting responds centuries later. "Your mistake was using a cat. Everyone knows cats already judge us in Latin. They just usually keep it to themselves." The book seems to have a sense of humor, which is more than can be said for most of your textbooks, especially A History of Magic, which reads like it was written by someone actively trying to make fascinating subjects terminally boring. You settle onto the floor, crossing your legs and letting your back rest against the cool stone wall, and begin to read in earnest as the castle sleeps around you, and the book's glow illuminates your face with light that seems to come from somewhere beyond the physical pages. The first proper chapter is titled On the Nature of Wanting, How Intention Shapes Incantation, and it explains that every spell is fundamentally a conversation between the wizard's will and the fabric of reality, which either says yes, no, or occasionally, "Are you sure about that?" The theoretical framework resembles actual quantum physics theories about observation affecting outcomes, and you wonder if Muggle scientists and wizards are studying the same phenomena from different angles, like two people describing an elephant while standing on opposite sides. The text discusses the difference between wanting something to happen and needing it to happen, explaining that Patronus charms work best when you protect rather than attack, because protection comes from love, and love is harder to fake than anger. Though the book notes, dryly, that some Slytherins have gotten quite good at faking it anyway, which seems unfair but also kind of funny. You read about the 3 classical elements of spellcasting that were identified by the founder of the International Warlock Convention in 1289, intention, pronunciation, and what the book calls theatrical flair, though modern wizards usually say wand movement because we're less honest about how much magic is actually performance art. The book quotes an argument between 2 12th century scholars about whether magic comes from within the wizard or is drawn from the environment, a debate that continues in modern magical theory with some professors insisting that magic is generated by the wizard's soul, while others argue that wizards merely channel ambient magical energy, and both sides produce impressive results which suggests maybe everyone's right, and magic doesn't care about our theoretical frameworks. You discover a section on wandless magic that most modern textbooks barely mention, and the book explains that African and some Asian magical traditions never relied heavily on wands, using instead direct channeling of intention through gesture and voice, which is actual historical fact that often gets overlooked in Eurocentric magical education. The author notes somewhat apologetically that the book itself is biased toward European traditions simply because that's where most of its contributors lived, but encourages readers to seek out other magical traditions because magic is a library, not a single book, and we impoverish ourselves by reading only one shelf. You're so absorbed that you don't notice time passing, don't notice the way the shadows lengthen and shift, don't notice that the castle has entered that deepest part of night when even the ghosts pause in their eternal wandering to contemplate whatever it is ghosts contemplate when they're alone. The pages turn almost by themselves now, responding to your curiosity like a familiar responding to its wizard's moods, and you find yourself reading about the history of the book itself, which was begun in 1142 by a witch named Aldegonde the Meticulous, who believed that magical knowledge should be preserved even when it was uncomfortable or dangerous, especially then. Aldegonde had survived the burning times when Muggles hunted wizards with particular enthusiasm, though actual historical records from that period are frustratingly sparse because wizards who were good at hiding didn't tend to advertise their existence by keeping detailed records, which makes sense but frustrates modern historians who study these periods and argue endlessly about how many wizards actually died versus how many simply got better at memory charms. The book explains that Aldegonde created these pages from papyrus she made herself using a process involving moonlight, intention, and apparently a significant amount of patience, which you respect, because making paper sounds tedious even before adding magic to the process. She enchanted the pages to repair themselves if torn, to multiply when more space was needed, and to gently discourage readers who approached with harmful intent, though the book admits that gentle discouragement in the 12th century sometimes involved minor hexes that modern readers would consider assault. But different times had different standards. Each subsequent owner added their own protections and contributions, building layers of magic and knowledge like sedimentary rock forming over millennia, and you can feel the weight of all those centuries pressing gently against your consciousness as you read. The book tells you about Marcus the Uncertain, who added extensively to the chapters on divination in 1340 and whose notes constantly contradict themselves because he never met a prophecy he couldn't interpret 3 different ways, and whose marginal commentary includes gems like "saw today in tea leaves," either great fortune or terrible disaster, possibly both, definitely something, which makes you laugh quietly in the silent library. Then there was Yuki, who traveled from Japan in 1567 and added comparative notes on Eastern magical practices, pointing out somewhat tartly that Europeans seemed to believe they invented magic, when clearly every human culture had been doing magic since humans existed, which is both historically accurate and a deserved criticism. Yuki's sections include beautiful brush-painted diagrams of energy flow and spell construction that look more like art than textbook illustrations, and her notes suggest that the rigid wand movements European wizards favored struck her as unnecessarily complicated when focused intention worked just as well, though she admitted wands did provide useful structure for beginners like training wheels on a bicycle provide structure before you learn balance. You read about the book's narrow escapes from destruction. Hidden in a false wall during the Goblin rebellions of 1612, smuggled out of a burning castle during a wizard duel in 1743, accidentally sold to a Muggle bookseller in 1820 who thankfully thought it was just an elaborate art project and resold it at a book fair where a wizard recognized it and bought it for 3 shillings. The book spent 50 years in the private collection of a wealthy Parisian wizard who never opened it because he collected books the way dragons collect gold, for the having not the reading, which the book itself notes with audible irritation, or at least you think you hear irritation in the way the pages rustle. In 1890, it arrived at Hogwarts through a donation from a graduating student who felt the book needed to be somewhere students could find it, though that student added a note requesting it be placed in the restricted section because some knowledge should require effort to obtain, makes you appreciate it more, like climbing a mountain versus taking a port key to the summit. The book contains actual spells, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, and you're careful not to attempt any because you're not stupid, despite what Professor Snape's expression suggests every time you enter his classroom, and you know that trying unknown magic in the middle of the night without supervision is how students end up as cautionary tales. But you can read about them, can study the theories and diagrams, can learn without doing, which is its own kind of power. There's a spell for finding lost things that works by making you remember where you left them, which is technically not finding but practically useful, and a charm for temporarily improving your memory that comes with a warning about headaches and an increased tendency to remember embarrassing moments from your childhood, which seems like a harsh trade-off. You discover a whole chapter on failed spells, experiments that didn't work, magical theories that turned out to be completely wrong, and you appreciate the honesty because most textbooks only show you success, only tell you about the spells that worked, never mention the centuries of wizards turning themselves inside out or accidentally animating their furniture with hostile intent. One entry from 1502 describes an attempt to create a spell for instant cleaning that instead made all dirt in a 100-foot radius actively seek out the caster, and the author notes, "Do not cast this spell. Am still finding mud in uncomfortable places weeks later. Dignity may never recover." Another failed spell from 1688 was supposed to translate any language, but instead made the caster speak exclusively in limericks for a month, and the diary entries from that period are both hilarious and somewhat sad, as the afflicted wizard tries to explain his condition to increasingly confused colleagues. The book discusses the ethics of memory charms with a nuance you've never encountered in Defense Against the Dark Arts class, acknowledging that sometimes memory modification is necessary for maintaining the statute of secrecy, but questioning whether wizards have the right to alter Muggle minds, even for protective purposes, a debate that continues at the highest levels of magical government with no clear resolution. Scholars argue about whether protective memory modification is fundamentally different from protective combat magic, and whether intention matters more than impact. And the book presents arguments from both sides without trying to resolve them, because some questions don't have clean answers. You learn about the actual historical development of the Patronus charm, which wasn't invented in ancient times as most people assume, but was actually codified in its current form in the 15th century by a wizard named Elias, who based it on much older protective magic traditions from multiple cultures, which is fascinating because it means the spell you learned in third year has a clear historical lineage you could trace if you had enough time and access to obscure magical archives. The book notes that earlier versions of the charm produced different results. Sometimes shields of light, sometimes animal spirits that spoke rather than attacked, sometimes just a feeling of overwhelming peace that made Dementors uncomfortable, and the modern standardized version is actually less flexible than its predecessors but easier to teach, which is the educational trade-off between depth and accessibility. You read about the connection between emotion and magic, how every spell carries the emotional signature of its caster like a fingerprint, and how skilled wizards can read those signatures the way you might read tone of voice, which explains how Dumbledore always seems to know when someone's lying because he's probably reading their magical signature like you read facial expressions. The book suggests that pureblood supremacists are threatened by Muggleborns, not because Muggleborns are weaker, which they aren't, but because Muggleborns bring fresh perspectives and question traditions that purebloods have never examined, and change is always threatening to people who benefit from things staying the same, which feels more like sociology than magic, but maybe they're not that different. You discover a recipe for Felix Felicis that's slightly different from the version in your advanced potion-making textbook, with a note explaining that the original medieval recipe required stirring exactly 1,428 times clockwise, followed by one counterclockwise stir, but modern brewers just use 1,440 because it's easier to count by 12s. And apparently the potion doesn't care about the 16 extra stirs, which makes you wonder how many other potion recipes are unnecessarily complicated because some medieval wizard was bad at math or just liked even numbers. The book's pages grow heavier as you progress deeper into its contents, not physically heavier, but weighted with the kind of knowledge that changes how you see the world, and you reach a section marked with a warning in 7 different languages, including 2. You don't recognize that all essentially say, "Proceed with caution, here there be consequences." The chapter is titled, "The Price of Power, A History of Ambition and Regret," and it catalogs the stories of wizards throughout history who sought forbidden knowledge and paid various prices, some metaphorical, some extremely literal, and all of them cautionary. You read about Acrisdus, the wizard who created Azkaban in the 15th century. though the book notes that historical records are unclear whether he created the island or merely enhanced existing dark properties, a debate among historians that gets heated because proper attribution matters, even for evil wizards, apparently. Echrisdus lured Muggle sailors to the island and tortured them for entertainment, which is genuinely horrifying, and his dark magic soaked so deeply into the stones that Dementors were drawn there even after his death, which raises interesting questions about whether places can become evil or merely retain the echo of evil acts, a philosophical distinction that matters less to the victims but fascinates scholars who study magical theory. The book suggests that Echrisdus's real crime wasn't ambition, but cruelty without purpose. Magic used to harm rather than to discover or protect, and notes that the Ministry of Magic's decision to use Azkaban as a prison rather than destroying it represents a concerning willingness to use dark magic when convenient, which seems like valid criticism, though probably not the kind you should mention to ministry officials. You learn about Herpo the Foul, an ancient Greek dark wizard from actual recorded history around 500 BCE who created the first basilisk, though scholars debate whether he truly invented the process or rediscovered older magic from Mesopotamian traditions, because apparently even evil inventions have disputed origin stories. The book includes Herpo's original notes on basilisk creation, which you definitely don't read too closely because some knowledge is dangerous, not because it corrupts you, but because now you know it's possible, and knowing possibilities changes what you might attempt in moments of desperation or curiosity. The text points out that Herpo's name literally means creepy crawler in Greek, which suggests either his parents had a dark sense of humor or he changed his name to match his aesthetic. And honestly, either option is kind of funny in a disturbing way that makes you feel slightly guilty for being amused. The book discusses the creation of Horcruxes with a clinical detachment that somehow makes the subject more rather than less disturbing, explaining the theoretical basis without providing actual instructions, which you appreciate because you've heard enough about Tom Riddle to know where that path leads. The text notes that the concept of soul-splitting appears in various magical traditions, but European wizards were unique in attempting to make it permanent through external objects, which other magical cultures viewed as profoundly unnatural because the soul's integrity is fundamental to human identity, and fracturing it is less like damage and more like suicide in extremely slow motion. Historical records suggest only 2 wizards in recorded history successfully created Horcruxes before Voldemort, and both went mad within decades as their fractured souls could no longer sustain coherent identity, which rather suggests the practice is self-limiting because you can't maintain dark wizard ambitions when you can't remember what you wanted or why. The book includes a heartbreaking letter from a medieval wizard to his daughter, explaining that his experiments with soul magic have left him unable to feel love or joy or connection, and begging her to destroy his research because no knowledge is worth the price he's paid, and the letter is dated 3 days before he walked into the sea and didn't return, which historical records list as an unexplained disappearance, but you now understand was a choice. You read about less dramatic failures too, the small prices paid for small ambitions. A wizard who tried to create a spell for eternal beauty and succeeded, but frozen his face into a permanent smile that eventually drove him to madness from the disconnect between internal feeling and external expression, which sounds like body horror but is presented as tragedy. Another wizard attempted to enhance her magical power by drawing on her life force directly and aged 40 years in a single night, spending her remaining years writing warnings that nobody heeded because every generation thinks they'll be smarter than the last, which is apparently universal across time and culture. The book notes that most forbidden magic isn't forbidden because it's evil, but because it's dangerous, the way fire is dangerous, useful but requiring respect and care that many practitioners lack, especially young practitioners who confuse confidence with competence, which feels like it might be directed at you personally, even though the text was written centuries ago. You discover a section on blood magic that explains the theoretical basis for the protection Harry Potter's mother gave him. And the book notes that ancient protective magic requiring sacrifice appears in nearly every magical culture because some truths are universal. Love is power. Sacrifice is transformation. And death, given meaning, becomes a kind of immortality, though not the kind most wizards seek. The historical debate about whether Lily Potter invented her protection or instinctively accessed older magic continues among scholars, with some arguing she combined Celtic and Roman protective traditions in a novel way, while others insist she created something entirely new through the intensity of her love and desperation. And both sides present compelling evidence which suggests maybe both are true and magic doesn't care about our taxonomies. You read about the four founders of Hogwarts and their disagreement about who should be taught magic, and the book presents Salazar Slytherin's position more sympathetically than you expected, noting that his concern about Muggleborns wasn't about blood purity, but about secrecy, born from genuine trauma after witnessing witch hunts in his youth. Though the text notes that trauma explains but doesn't excuse, and his solution was still wrong even if his fear was understandable. The book suggests that Slytherin's departure from Hogwarts wasn't the dramatic abandonment most histories portray, but a gradual distancing after years of argument with Gryffindor, and the Chamber of Secrets was built not as a weapon, but as a last resort if the school was ever overrun by Muggle attackers, though leaving a basilisk as a security system shows questionable judgment at best. Historical records from the period are fragmentary because the founders didn't document their disagreements in detail, probably because they hoped to resolve them privately, which means modern historians fill gaps with educated guesses that sometimes say more about the historian than the history. You learn about the actual historical Merlin, or at least the wizard who held that name, because the book suggests Merlin might have been a title rather than a personal name, passed down through generations of powerful wizards the way Caesar became a title in Rome. Though this theory is disputed by scholars who point to specific historical references that seem to describe one person rather than many. The text notes dryly that Merlin's reputation for wisdom comes partly from his actual magical skill, but mostly from his talent for not writing things down so later generations could attribute whatever they wanted to him without contradiction, which is either clever legacy management or just lucky depending on your interpretation. You turn to a section filled with spells written in languages that shift and change as you look at them, the text refusing to remain static, as if the knowledge itself is alive and trying to avoid being pinned down like a butterfly in a collector's case. The chapter is titled Lost Tongues and Living Words, a primer on magical linguistics, and it explains that magic has always been multilingual because magic predates human language, which means any language can work as long as the speaker binds intention to sound, though some linguistic structures facilitate certain types of magic better than others. You learn that Latin became the standard for European spells not because it's inherently more magical than other languages, but because medieval magical education happened through the Catholic Church, which used Latin, and once a tradition establishes itself, it's easier to continue than change. Which is why you still learn spells in Latin even though the language died naturally centuries ago. The book presents actual scholarly arguments about whether incantations in one language work better than another, with some researchers claiming Latin's grammatical precision makes spell construction clearer, while others argue that any language works equally well and the supposed superiority of Latin is just European bias dressed up as scholarship. And the book presents evidence for both sides, including experimental results that seem to support each position depending on how you interpret them. You discover that African magical traditions often use tonal languages for spell casting because the musical quality of tone can encode additional meaning beyond words, and changes in pitch can modify a spell's intensity or target with more precision than Latin's case endings, which makes sense when you think about it but rarely gets mentioned in your classes at Hogwarts, probably because most professors learned magic in the European tradition and teach what they know. The book includes a fascinating section on dead magical languages, including one spoken by ancient Egyptian wizards that encoded spells as hieroglyphic sequences that looked like decorative art to non-magical people, which provided excellent security because Muggles would preserve the spells thinking they were merely religious texts, and modern scholars who decode ancient Egyptian writing occasionally stumble onto actual functional magic without realizing it, which has led to some confused archaeology papers. You learn about the language of the Atlantean wizards, assuming Atlantis existed, which the book notes is contested among historians who can't agree whether references to Atlantis describe an actual place, a metaphor for lost knowledge, or just a story Plato made up to make philosophical points, though the book suggests that magical artifacts recovered from certain underwater ruins suggest someone was doing advanced magic somewhere that later sank, regardless of whether they called it Atlantis. The text explains that many so-called dead magical languages aren't actually dead but merely sleeping, preserved in spell construction and waiting for speakers who can revive them, and learning these languages opens access to magic that functions slightly differently than modern spells, like the difference between classical music and jazz, both music, but with different internal logic. You attempt to read a spell written in what the book identifies as Old Norse, and the runes shimmer and rearrange themselves as you focus, trying to teach you their meaning through direct experience rather than translation, which is disorienting but also kind of exciting, like learning to swim by being thrown in water, terrifying but effective. The spell seems to involve transformation magic, specifically turning stone to water or water to stone, and you realize with a start that this might be related to transfiguration theory, which Professor McGonagall presents as modern magic but apparently has roots in medieval Norse practices, which makes sense given that Vikings got around and probably spread their magical traditions along with their genes and their trading goods. You find yourself thinking about how magic travels between cultures, how spells migrate and evolve and adapt to new languages the way words migrate between languages, borrowing and changing and sometimes losing their original meaning in translation. And you realize that the history of magic is really a history of people sharing knowledge despite barriers of language and culture and time. At this moment, you feel connected to every wizard who ever read this book, every student who sat where you're sitting now, and the sensation is so overwhelming that you need to pause and breathe. And in that pause, you think about how many people across how many countries must share the same curiosity about magic and history and forbidden knowledge, and you can't help but wonder, I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The book continues with a section on magical etymology, tracing how spell names evolved and changed over centuries. And you learn that Expelliarmus is actually a fairly modern construction combining Latin root words in a way that would have confused ancient Romans, who would have used different grammatical structures. But the spell works because intention matters more than linguistic purity, which is reassuring given that your Latin pronunciation probably makes ancient scholars weep. The text discusses the debate among magical linguists about whether pre-verbal magic is possible, or whether humans need language as a framework for focusing intention, with some arguing that accidental magic from children proves intention alone suffices, while others counter that children's accidental magic is unfocused and wild, precisely because it lacks linguistic structure, and both sides present compelling arguments that probably both contain truth, because magic seems to resist simple explanations. You discover that some spells work better when whispered and others when shouted, and the book suggests this relates to how sound carries intention. Whispered spells work for subtle magic because whispering requires focus and control, while shouted spells work for powerful magic because shouting releases inhibition and channels raw emotion. Though the book notes that this is a generalization and some wizards prefer to whisper everything while others bellow even the simplest charms. And magic accommodates different styles because it's flexible that way. The section on nonverbal magic explains that it's not actually silent but uses an internal language of intention that's faster than speech, though harder to learn because you need perfect clarity of purpose. Which is why Snape can cast spells non-verbally but still speaks when he wants you to understand what he's doing, and why truly powerful wizards like Dumbledore seem to cast effortlessly because they've internalized the language so completely that thought becomes magic without conscious translation. You read about magical sign languages developed by deaf wizards throughout history, and the book notes somewhat angrily that these are rarely taught in mainstream magical education despite being just as effective as spoken spells, and sometimes more precise because sign language can encode multiple parameters simultaneously through different hand shapes and positions and movements. But hearing wizards assumed sign language was less powerful because they confused volume with power, which is ableist and wrong, and has deprived magical society of valuable knowledge. And the book's criticism feels contemporary despite being written decades or centuries ago, because some problems persist across time. The text includes actual research from the 1800s, when a group of deaf wizards at a school in France developed a complete signed magical system that achieved results identical to spoken spells, but faster because signs don't require breath and can be executed while doing other things with your voice, like singing or shouting warnings or breathing during duels, and the research was published and ignored because the magical establishment didn't want to admit that their traditional methods weren't the only effective approach, which is frustrating but apparently typical of institutions resistant to change. The pages grow cold under your fingers as you enter a section of the book that actively resists being read, the text blurring and shifting whenever you try to focus directly on it, forcing you to read from the corner of your eye like trying to see stars by not looking at them. A technique astronomers actually use called averted vision that works because the edges of your retina are more sensitive to dim light than the center. The chapter is titled "The Spells That Protect Themselves" on self-preserving magic. And it explains that truly dangerous knowledge doesn't want to be learned easily because the difficulty of learning is itself a filter, ensuring only persistent and capable wizards access spells that could harm themselves or others if used carelessly. The book itself is protected by layers of enchantments added over centuries by wizards who wanted to preserve knowledge but not make it too accessible, which is the educational equivalent of putting medicine in child-proof bottles. And you can feel the spells testing you as you read, probing your intentions gently, like a healer checking for injuries. You discover that the first protection is confusion, and indeed, the text keeps trying to distract you with tangential information and interesting but irrelevant side notes, like the fact that medieval wizards believed dragons sneezed fire because they had chronic allergies to knights, which is obviously nonsense, but makes you smile and pulls your attention away from the more dangerous content, which is exactly the point. The second protection is tedium, and suddenly the text becomes incredibly boring, discussing at length the theoretical basis for spell construction, using terminology so technical and dry that your eyes start to glaze over. And you realize this is intentional, a way of making dangerous knowledge so tiresome to acquire that only the truly determined will push through, which is clever, but also kind of mean, because the book is essentially saying, if you're not willing to be bored, you don't deserve the good stuff. You push through the tedium stubborn in the way that got you into Gryffindor, and the text eventually rewards you by becoming interesting again, though you note that the protection worked on you briefly, because you did consider skipping ahead, which means the spell is effective even when you know it's happening, which is impressive magic. The third protection is riddles, and suddenly the text is written in elaborate metaphors and symbolic language that requires you to think carefully about meaning, describing a spell for detecting lies as the art of seeing truth's reflection in the mirror of words, which is poetic but not exactly helpful for practical casting, though you suppose that's the point. Because if you can't decode the metaphor, you probably shouldn't be attempting the spell. The book presents actual historical examples of protective riddles, including one from a 13th century grimoire that described a healing spell entirely in terms of gardening metaphors, comparing wounds to weeds and healing to cultivation, which worked fine for the agricultural society that created it, but completely baffled later urban wizards until someone realized the pattern, and now scholars argue about whether metaphorical spell descriptions are security measures or just how people thought about magic before modern scientific frameworks, probably both depending on the specific case. You work through a riddle about transformation that describes changing form as wearing another skin without theft, being yourself while being other, and you realize it's talking about animagus transformation, which you're definitely not ready to attempt but find fascinating to read about. Especially the part explaining that your animagus form reflects your personality, but also influences your personality in a feedback loop. So wizards who spend too much time as animals start thinking like their animal form, even when human, which is why animagi registration exists, not just for security, but for medical monitoring. The fourth protection is fear, and the pages suddenly display images of spells gone wrong, vivid illustrations that it's like photographs showing wizards transformed into bizarre hybrid creatures, their faces frozen in expressions of horror or confusion, or worst of all, acceptance of their new forms. One image shows a wizard who tried to merge with his cat for better reflexes and is now permanently stuck halfway between human and feline, and the illustration captures the profound wrongness of the form in a way that makes your stomach turn, which is the intended effect, because some knowledge requires understanding the stakes before you proceed. The book notes that these aren't hypothetical scenarios, but actual cases from magical hospital records, preserved as warnings, and suddenly this isn't an adventure anymore, but a serious engagement with magic that has real consequences for real people. And you feel your curiosity tempered by appropriate caution, which is probably healthy. The fifth protection is empathy, and you find yourself reading firsthand accounts from wizards who suffered because of forbidden magic, not just physical suffering, but emotional and psychological damage, and the text forces you to understand them as people, not cautionary tales, complete with families and dreams and fears. And one account from a witch who tried to resurrect her dead husband and succeeded in bringing back something that looked like him, but wasn't. And her description of realizing she created an empty shell that moved like him and spoke like him, but lacked whatever essential quality made him himself, is genuinely heartbreaking and makes you understand why necromancy is forbidden, not from moral judgment, but from compassion for everyone involved. The sixth protection is choice, and the book explicitly tells you that you can stop reading now, that there's no shame in deciding you've learned enough, that wisdom includes knowing your limits, and the fact that the book gives you permission to stop makes you paradoxically more willing to continue because it proves the book respects your agency rather than trying to seduce you into foolishness, which is manipulative in its own way, but at least it's benevolent manipulation aimed at keeping you safe. You choose to continue reading, accepting responsibility for whatever knowledge comes next, and the book seems to sigh with something between approval and resignation, like a teacher who warned you but respects your decision to learn from experience. The chapter finally reveals spells for detecting magical traces, which sounds mundane until you realize this magic lets you see the residue left by all spells cast in an area, essentially reading the magical history of a place like archaeologists read stratigraphy. And the book explains that this is protective knowledge because it lets you detect if someone has cast harmful magic nearby. But it's also dangerous knowledge because it could be used to track people or uncover secrets they want kept, which is why the spell includes built-in limitations that make it work only on spaces, not on people, and only show recent magic, not historical casting. Though the book notes that these limitations can be overcome with enough skill and questionable ethics, which is a nice way of saying sufficiently immoral wizards have found loopholes. You practice the wand movement for the detection spell without actually casting it, just memorizing the pattern of loops and spirals that look like you're drawing infinity symbols in three-dimensional space, and you notice that the movement itself is beautiful, almost like dancing, which makes you wonder if all magic is aesthetic at its core. If the reason spells have elaborate gestures is partly functional, but partly because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who find meaning in beauty and structure. The book opens into a section that seems to have more depth than the physical pages should allow, as if you're looking not at paper, but through a window into somewhere else, and the chapter is titled Flesh and Form, the Ancient Art of Transformation, which you realize with a mix of excitement and trepidation is about transfiguration taken to extremes beyond what Professor McGonagall teaches in her careful, measured lessons. The text begins with a disclaimer that transformation magic is fundamentally about identity, and every change you make to your form changes not just how others see you, but how you see yourself, which is why the most dangerous transformations aren't the ones that could trap you in another body, but the ones that might make you forget you were ever yourself to begin with, which is philosophical but also practical, because apparently long-term transformation can affect memory and personality in ways that are difficult to reverse. You read about the earliest transformation magic, which, according to the book, predates wands and possibly predates human civilization as we understand it, with legends from multiple cultures describing shamans and wise ones who could take animal form to hunt or scout or communicate with nature spirits. And while modern wizards treat these as folklore, the book suggests they're historical accounts of actual magic that worked differently than modern transfiguration, because it was based in different cultural frameworks and spiritual practices. The text discusses the theoretical difference between transfiguration as taught at Hogwarts, which changes your form while maintaining your identity as a human temporarily wearing another shape, versus true transformation magic, which merges you with the new form so completely that the distinction between original and transformed becomes meaningless. And you realize this is what animagus transformation approaches but doesn't quite achieve, because registered animagi can always return to human form, can always remember they're human, whereas true transformation might not offer that comfort. You learn about skinwalkers from indigenous American magical traditions, and the book is careful to note that these practices are sacred and culturally specific, and not something European wizards should appropriate, but includes the information because understanding different approaches to transformation broadens your theoretical framework, and skinwalking involves a relationship with the animal form that's more like partnership than disguise, which is fundamentally different from how European wizards think about transfiguration as control over matter. The chapter includes historical accounts of wizards who achieved perfect transformation and chose to remain in animal form permanently, like a wizard in the 1400s who became an eagle and was last seen flying toward the Arctic Circle, never to return. And the book treats this not as tragedy, but as transcendence, as someone finding a form more true to their identity than the body they were born with, which is surprisingly progressive for what you assume is an old text. Though maybe wizards have always understood that identity is flexible, because they literally can change forms. You discover the actual process for becoming an animagus, which Professor McGonagall mentioned in class but never explained in detail. And it's far more involved than you imagined, requiring a mandrake leaf held in your mouth for an entire month, which is disgusting, but also makes sense because you need to physically internalize the transformation. Need your body to know the magic at a cellular level. The book notes that many aspiring animagi fail because they swallow the leaf accidentally while sleeping or eating or laughing, and there's something darkly funny about profound magical transformation being defeated by basic human needs like not choking on leaves. Though the book notes this is actually by design because the difficulty ensures only patient and careful wizards complete the process, which is important when the alternative is getting stuck halfway through transformation looking like a disturbing hybrid creature from a nightmare. The text reveals that your animagus form is determined by your personality but also by your genetics, your experiences, your fears and hopes and dreams, all filtering through magical processes that nobody fully understands to produce a form that represents your truest self. And the book notes that sometimes people are disappointed by their form because it reflects who they are rather than who they want to be, like the proud wizard who expected a lion and got a mouse. Though the book notes that mice are survivors and intelligence and adaptability matter more than size, which is a kind consolation but probably didn't help the disappointed wizard much. You read about unregistered animagi throughout history, wizards who completed the transformation but never told the ministry, and the book is ambiguous about whether this is rebellious freedom or dangerous irresponsibility, presenting arguments for both positions, including actual quotes from historical wizards defending their choice to remain unregistered, with one 16th century witch arguing that the government has no right to know about magical abilities that don't harm others and registration is just a tool of control, which sounds reasonable until you consider that unregistered animagi could commit crimes in animal form and evade detection, which is why the ministry requires registration, and you find yourself genuinely uncertain which position you support, which is probably the book's intention. The chapter discusses partial transformation, which is possible but dangerous, and you read about wizards who transformed only their hands to claws or their eyes to eagle vision, and most accounts end badly because the human body is integrated and changing parts of it without changing the supporting systems causes problems, like transforming your muscles to be stronger without transforming your bones to support the additional strength results in broken bones and torn ligaments, which makes sense in retrospect, but apparently wasn't obvious to enthusiastic experimental wizards. You discover a section on empathic transformation, which is magic that lets you understand animals by temporarily sharing their perceptual frameworks without fully transforming, and this sounds much safer than actual transformation, until the book notes that experiencing reality as a different species can be psychologically disorienting because you're using a human brain to process non-human sensory input, like trying to run dog software on human hardware, and the incompatibility can cause lasting confusion about your own identity, which several historical cases demonstrate in disturbing detail. The book includes an account from a wizard who empathically connected with an owl to understand flight, and afterward couldn't shake the conviction that his arms should be wings, and spent years in magical therapy learning to feel comfortable in his human body again, which is presented not as a cautionary tale about not trying empathic magic, but as a reminder to approach it with preparation and support and exit strategies. You read about theoretical transformations that nobody has successfully achieved, like becoming water or fire or air, transforming into elements rather than living creatures, and the book explains why this is probably impossible. Elements lack consciousness and identity, so there's nothing for human consciousness to merge with. You just cease to be rather than transform, though some scholars argue that achieving elemental form is actually achieving enlightenment and transcending physical existence entirely, which is either spiritual truth or magical nonsense depending on whether you ask a mystic or a scientist, and the book presents both views without choosing sides. The text notes that the closest anyone has come to elemental transformation is the Patronus charm, which transforms emotional energy into semi-corporeal form. And while a Patronus isn't exactly elemental, it's not exactly animal either, existing in some intermediate space that suggests the categories we use for understanding magic might be less rigid than we assume, which is the kind of observation that makes you want to rethink everything you thought you knew, which is probably exactly what the book wants you to do. The pages suddenly pulse with golden light, warm and ancient, and you feel the book connecting you to something larger than itself, drawing you into a vision or memory, or perhaps both at once, and you find yourself standing in a version of Hogwarts that is both familiar and impossibly different, the stones newer and the architecture simpler, the magic raw and unrefined, like tasting honey straight from the comb instead of processed into sugar. 4 figures stand in the great hall, which isn't yet great, but just a hall, large and drafty and still smelling of fresh-cut stone, and you recognize them from countless portraits and historical accounts, though they look younger and more real than any painting captured. And you realize you're seeing the founders themselves through whatever magic the book has woven to preserve this moment. Godric Gryffindor gestures passionately as he speaks, his robes practical rather than decorative, his sword hanging at his belt not for show but for use, because these are times when wizards still need physical weapons to supplement magic, and historical records confirm that early medieval wizards routinely carried swords as backup when spells failed or magical energy depleted, which happened more often before modern wand technology improved magical efficiency. Rowena Ravenclaw listens with a slight smile that suggests she's hearing the argument beneath Godric's words, her blue robe simple but perfectly tailored, her hands folded in a gesture that appears peaceful, but you sense conceals readiness to cast at any moment, and you understand that these are people who survived dangerous times, who built a school because they needed a place where magic could be practiced openly without fear of persecution or attack, which gives their achievement different weight than the sanitized histories suggest. Helga Hufflepuff sits at a rough wooden table, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, and she's drinking something from a pottery cup that steams in the cold air, and there's dirt under her fingernails from working in what will eventually become the gardens, and you realize she's the one who literally built much of this school, with magic and labor combined, which makes sense for Hufflepuff values, but rarely gets acknowledged because physical labor is less dramatic than dueling or philosophical debate. Salazar Slytherin stands slightly apart, his arms crossed, his expression wary rather than hostile, and he looks tired in a way that speaks of trauma and loss, and the book feeds you context without words. He has watched friends burn, has lost family to Muggle violence, has every reason to fear what happens when non-magical people discover magical ones, and his arguments for restriction come from genuine fear, not pure-blood supremacy, though fear can curdle into prejudice given time and reinforcement. You hear their debate not in words but in concepts flowing directly into your understanding, and Godric argues that magic is a gift meant to help all people, that hiding creates more danger than openness because fear grows in darkness and understanding grows in light, that Muggle-born wizards are proof that magic belongs to no bloodline but to humanity itself. And his argument is idealistic but also practical because magical populations are small and need every wizard they can train to defend against threats both magical and mundane. Rowena adds that knowledge flourishes through diversity, that different perspectives solving problems in different ways generates innovation and discovery, that a school teaching only purebloods would stagnate intellectually within generations, and her argument is characteristically focused on pragmatism rather than morality, though both lead to the same conclusion, and you realize she's arguing not against Salazar, but past him, laying groundwork for future generations who will read her words and understand. Helga speaks about community and belonging, about how the greatest magic comes not from power, but from connection, from wizards working together and supporting each other and building something larger than individual achievement. And she argues that excluding Muggleborns would fracture the community before it properly forms. would establish division as the school's foundation, which would poison everything built upon it. And her words carry weight because everyone respects her judgment about what makes groups function effectively. Salazar responds that idealism without caution is suicide, that the statute of secrecy doesn't exist yet because it won't be established for centuries, that they're building this school in a time when being discovered as magical means death, and teaching children who might accidentally reveal magic to their Muggle families risks everyone. And his fear is genuine, even if his solution is flawed, and you understand that historical conflicts rarely have clear villains, just people with different fears, making different choices based on different values. The vision shows you their compromise, the decision to admit all magical children but teach them carefully about secrecy, to value all houses equally while acknowledging different strengths, to build a school that can adapt as society changes, and you see them working together despite disagreement, their combined magic stronger than any individual contribution, which is the actual lesson they meant to teach and often gets lost in later retellings. The vision shifts, and you see Salazar leaving, not in anger, but in sorrow. And he's not abandoning the school, but withdrawing because he can't reconcile his fear with their hope, and the Chamber of Secrets he leaves behind is not a weapon, but a last resort, a contingency plan if his worst fears prove true, though the monster he leaves is poor judgment regardless of intention. You see the other founders mourning his departure, not because they agree with him, but because they understand him, because friendship doesn't require identical values, just mutual respect and care. And their sadness at his leaving feels more real than any dramatic confrontation would. More historically plausible, because real disagreements usually end not with explosions, but with doors quietly closing. The vision shows you the school growing, generations of students learning and leaving and sometimes returning to teach. And you see how each generation adds to Hogwarts not just physically but magically. Every spell cast leaving traces, every emotion felt soaking into the stones, every lesson learned becoming part of the school's memory, and you understand that Hogwarts isn't just a building, but an entity, something alive in ways that don't fit normal definitions of life, conscious in ways that don't map to human consciousness, which explains why the castle shifts and changes and seems to respond to students' needs, because it actually does. You witness moments of historical importance. The school's evacuation during a dragon attack in 1320, when a mother dragon mistook the castle for a mountain cave and tried to nest in the astronomy tower, which sounds absurd, but historical records confirm a dragon incident at Hogwarts, though details are sparse, probably because evacuating several hundred panicking students while avoiding dragonfire didn't leave much time for documentation. You see the school during plague years, when it served as a refuge for magical children orphaned by disease, which Muggle history calls the Black Death, but wizards know had both natural and magical components, with dark wizards exploiting the chaos and spreading enhanced diseases that killed magical and non-magical people alike, until healers developed treatments, though not before millions died, which gives context for why wizards eventually chose separation over integration. You see the school during the Goblin Rebellions when it sheltered refugees from both sides, because not all goblins supported rebellion and not all wizards supported the Ministry's violent responses. And the founders' inclusive vision meant Hogwarts remained neutral ground, where goblins and wizards could negotiate even while their governments fought, which is rarely mentioned in history books focused on battles rather than diplomacy. The vision shows you that Hogwarts has always been more than a school, has been sanctuary and hospital and occasionally prison, has been whatever magical Britain needed it to be, because the founders built it to serve rather than rule, to adapt rather than impose, and you feel profound gratitude for their wisdom and sacrifice, for choosing to build something lasting rather than something powerful, something that would outlive them and continue growing and changing to meet needs they couldn't have anticipated, because the future always surprises us no matter how carefully we plan. The golden light fades slowly, like sunset rather than switching off, and you return to yourself sitting in the restricted section holding a book that somehow showed you history not through words, but through experience. And you understand that this is the book's true power, not the spells it contains, but the wisdom it conveys. The understanding that magic is not about power, but about connection, not about control, but about harmony, not about hiding, but about becoming more fully yourself while remaining connected to others. You close the book with gentle reverence, feeling the weight of everything you've learned settling into your bones like warmth on a cold day, and the cover feels different now, warmer somehow, as if it's acknowledged your reading and approved of how you handled the knowledge within its pages. And you sit for a moment, just breathing in the quiet of the library where dust motes still dance in your wand light like tiny stars describing their own constellations. The castle around you breathes too, the subtle sounds of old stone settling, the whisper of wind through corridors, the distant hoot of an owl returning from hunting, and you realize that Hogwarts has been watching you this whole time through whatever awareness lives in its ancient walls, and you feel protected rather than observed, as if the castle itself has been keeping you safe while you explored dangerous knowledge. You stand slowly, your legs stiff from sitting too long, and you place the book back on its lectern where it belongs. And as you turn to leave, you notice something you hadn't seen before. A small brass plaque on the lectern's base that reads, "Knowledge seeks the worthy, wisdom seeks the kind." And you wonder if that was always there, or if the book created it just for you. A message to carry forward into whatever future awaits you. The walk back through the restricted section feels different now. The shadows less threatening and more like old friends. The chained books like guards protecting treasure rather than jailers keeping secrets. And you understand that forbidden knowledge isn't forbidden because it's evil, but because it requires maturity and judgment and compassion to use responsibly. And maybe you're not quite ready for all of it, but you're learning, which is the point of being at Hogwarts anyway. To learn not just spells, but wisdom. Not just power, but restraint. Not just knowledge, but understanding. You pass through the chain, marking the restricted section's entrance, and you carefully drape it back across the opening, not securing it fully because you're not sure how, but making it clear that the section is meant to be restricted, that whoever comes next should make a conscious choice to enter rather than wandering in accidentally, which seems important somehow, this idea that forbidden knowledge should require intention and effort to access. The main library stretches before you in darkness, the rows of normal books sleeping peacefully, and you extinguish your wand light and stand for a moment letting your eyes adjust. And the darkness is less complete than you expected because starlight filters through the high windows and the enchanted ceiling reflects whatever sky exists beyond the castle's protection. You make your way between the shelves by memory and faint starlight, your feet knowing the path even when your eyes struggle. And you think about how much of life is like this, navigating by feel and trust and accumulated knowledge rather than clear vision, taking steps forward even when you can't see where you'll end up, which is either courage or foolishness depending on how things turn out, though maybe the difference between courage and foolishness is just whether you survive to tell the story. The library door opens silently at your touch, and you step into the corridor where the portraits sleep in their frames, their painted occupants snoring or mumbling in dreams, and one portrait of a medieval knight stirs slightly as you pass and mumbles something about dragons that might be his actual memory, or might be just a painted dream, and you wonder if portraits truly are people or just echoes of people. If there's enough of the original personality preserved to call them alive, or if they're sophisticated, magical recordings. And you realize this is another question without a clean answer. Another place where magic resists easy categorization. You climb the stairs toward Gryffindor Tower, and the staircases cooperate tonight, perhaps sensing your exhaustion or perhaps just coincidentally being where you need them to be, and you're grateful either way because you're too tired for additional adventure. The castle sleeps around you, hundreds of students in their beds dreaming whatever students dream, and you're aware of being part of something larger, this community of magical people all learning and growing and occasionally sneaking into restricted sections to read forbidden books. And the thought makes you smile because you're not special exactly, not chosen or destined or unique. Just one more student in a long line of students all trying to understand magic and themselves and how to live in a world that includes both wonder and danger. The fat lady's portrait guards the Gryffindor entrance, and she's deeply asleep, snoring with impressive volume, and you whisper the password, Fortuna Major, this week, and she stirs and squints at you and mumbles something about young people wandering at all hours before swinging open to let you pass. And you feel a rush of affection for her because even grumpy and half asleep, she's protecting your house, doing her job, being part of this strange, magical family you've joined. The common room is dark and warm. The fire burned down to coals that glow softly like sleeping rubies, and you sink into your favorite armchair near the hearth and just sit for a moment, letting the exhaustion catch up to you. Feeling the deep tiredness that comes not from physical effort, but from mental and emotional engagement, from learning things that change how you see the world. You think about the book and its centuries of accumulated knowledge, about the wizards who contributed to it and the wizards who read it before you, about the founders and their dreams for this school, about transformation and language and the prices paid for power, about all the small jokes and large truths you discovered tonight, and you realize that knowledge isn't really about accumulation, isn't about how many facts you can memorize or spells you can cast, but about understanding, about seeing connections, about becoming someone who can handle complexity and ambiguity and still choose kindness. The coals in the fireplace pulse gently like a slow heartbeat, and you watch their red glow dim and brighten, and your breathing synchronizes with their rhythm without conscious intention, and you feel yourself sinking deeper into the chair, your muscles relaxing, your thoughts beginning to drift and scatter like leaves on wind. You think about sleeping here in the common room rather than climbing to your dormitory, and the thought is pleasant, the chair comfortable enough, the fire warm enough, the darkness soft enough, and your eyelids grow heavy like they're weighted with sand, and you let them close. Let your head rest against the chair's high back. Let your hands rest loose in your lap. Outside the window, stars wheel across the sky in their ancient patterns, constellations you've learned to name in astronomy class. And somewhere an owl calls, and somewhere the castle settles into deeper sleep, and somewhere the book waits in its restricted section for the next curious student to find it and learn and grow. You drift in that space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts become dreams and dreams become thoughts, and you imagine you can feel the castle dreaming around you. Imagine you can sense the magic moving through the stones like blood through veins. Imagine you can hear the whispers of all the students who came before and all who will come after, all connected by this place and this experience and this strange, wonderful, impossible education in magic. The last thought that crosses your mind before sleep takes you completely is gratitude, simple and profound. Gratitude for magic and knowledge and forbidden books and ancient castles and second chances and the complicated, messy, beautiful experience of being young and curious and alive in a world that contains both wonder and danger and infinite possibilities for those brave enough or foolish enough to reach for them. And then even that thought dissolves into wordless peace, as sleep claims you and carries you down into dreams where perhaps you'll fly, or perhaps you'll study, or perhaps you'll just rest. And any of those would be perfectly fine, because you've learned enough for one night, discovered enough for one adventure. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply close your eyes and trust that tomorrow will bring new questions and new answers and new reasons to be grateful for the strange gift of magic that runs through your blood and bones and makes you part of this ancient story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. But for now, right now. In this moment, you're here, and you're safe, and you're sleeping in a castle full of magic, and that's enough, more than enough. It's everything.